An airport security officer beat a black CEO with his radio as his restrained children screamed for help, but moments later, that same radio was used to cave in the officer's skull. He struck a father with his radio as his children screamed, thinking fear would silence everyone. Subscribe if you believe no badge is above the law. Julian Cross didn't slow his stride as he and his two sons moved through the main concourse of Halton International Airport. The sound of rolling luggage, echoing announcements, and the rhythmic chatter of travelers faded into background noise as he kept his focus ahead, toward Lane 7 of the security checkpoint. His designer overcoat moved like a blade through the air, his steps brisk but composed, every inch the posture of a man used to command. Behind him, 10-year-old Amir clutched his stuffed owl, Captain Fluff, tightly against his chest, while 16-year-old Caleb followed closely, wheeling their carry-on with one hand and holding onto his little brother's shoulder with the other. They were coming off a monumental trip. Hours earlier, Julian had walked off a Capitol Summit stage to thunderous applause, having just unveiled a game-changing defense innovation that secured Aerodynamics a $2.2 billion federal contract. The media had called him a pioneer, a visionary. But now, in this moment, none of that mattered. The only thing on Julian's mind was catching their connecting flight, grabbing those cinnamon rolls Amir loved from the bakery in Terminal B and easing them through security without hassle. "Man," Caleb muttered, watching his father's purposeful pace, "you walk like you own the place." Julian chuckled softly. "Maybe I do," he replied, tossing his son a quick glance. But the moment they turned into the line for Lane 7, the mood shifted. Julian's practiced steps slowed. Something felt off, like a sudden drop in cabin pressure before turbulence. Ahead stood a towering man in a TSA uniform, thick neck, square jaw, buzz-cut hair that looked more like a warning than a style. His badge read Vorn, Brent Vorn. He wasn't scanning luggage or waving people through. He was watching, and not in a routine way. His eyes were fixed, narrow, judgmental, studying Julian and his sons as they approached. Brent leaned slightly toward a younger officer beside him, whispered something too low to hear, then straightened. His stance widened, alert but calculated. Julian felt the change immediately, like stepping onto black ice. He tightened his grip on the handle of Amir's backpack. Julian reached for his ID and boarding pass, calm and ready. "Good afternoon," he said politely, holding out the documents. Brent didn't respond. He didn't even look at the ID. His eyes stayed locked on the boys. "Random screening," Brent said flatly, voice void of warmth. Julian blinked. "Excuse me?" Brent's tone didn't change. "You've been selected for additional screening." "We're already pre-cleared," Julian said, his voice measured, firm but respectful. "Global Fast Pass clearance. You can scan it." "Step aside, now," Brent interrupted, motioning with two fingers to the guards stationed nearby. Caleb instinctively shifted in front of Amir. Julian placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder, steady, warning. Two guards emerged from the lane's side wall like shadows peeling off glass, walking toward them with quiet intensity. They weren't carrying wands or scanning devices. They were positioning themselves, one to Julian's left, one to his right, a classic flank. Julian's instincts sharpened. This wasn't standard. There was no alarm, no commotion, no procedural announcement, and yet they were being boxed in like suspects. Julian's mind flickered through possible reasons, but none made sense. They'd cleared security protocols 100 times before. He had no criminal record, no flight risk profile, and yet... Caleb leaned in slightly. "Dad," he whispered, "why are they acting like we did something wrong?" Julian didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed on Brent, who hadn't moved, who hadn't blinked. "We're just following orders," Brent said when Julian didn't step back. "I'm not refusing," Julian replied carefully, "but I'd like to understand the basis of the screening. Especially in front of my children." Brent's mouth curled slightly, not a smile, but something colder. "You people always ask too many questions." Julian's eyes narrowed, the breath caught in his chest. "What do you mean by you people?" Brent didn't reply. He tilted his chin at one of the guards who unlatched a gate beside the main conveyor belt. "Sir," the other guard said in a tone rehearsed for moments like this, "please step out of line." Julian hesitated, then glanced at Amir, who now clung to his owl with both hands, wide-eyed, confused. The child looked like he wanted to cry but wasn't sure if he was allowed to. Caleb's jaw had tightened, his teenage instincts flaring with anger. Julian turned to Brent. "I'll cooperate," he said, quieter this time. "But I want it on record that we're being pulled without cause." Brent finally took a step forward. The fluorescent lighting above gleamed off his badge and the metallic walkie on his hip. He stood close, too close, his shadow falling across Julian's face. He held out a clipboard. "Sign the waiver. Waive your rights, or we confiscate everything." Julian's lips parted in disbelief. "That's not how FastPass protocol works." Brent's brow twitched. "This is how my protocol works." Julian took a deep breath. "You're making a mistake." Caleb reached into his pocket and lifted his phone. "I'm recording this," he announced. The phone didn't stay in his hand long. One of the guards moved faster than anyone expected, swiping the phone and knocking it to the tile floor with a loud clack. It skidded under the conveyor belt. "No devices here," the guard said sharply. Amir whimpered. "Daddy, why are they yelling?" Julian knelt quickly, gathering both boys in his arms. "We're okay," he whispered. "It's just a mistake." "Stay calm." "I promise." Brent chuckled. It was a low, dry sound. "Mistake?" He stepped even closer, chest brushing against Julian's shoulder. "No, this is exactly what it looks like." Julian stood slowly, his hands clenched but low, voice steady. "Whatever this is, don't do it in front of my sons." Brent didn't answer. He just gave a nod. That's when the two guards stepped in again. One reached for Caleb's arm. The other unhooked a zip tie from his belt. "Hey, what are you doing?" Julian shouted, instinctively grabbing his son's wrist. The guards didn't stop. Caleb was yanked backward, his eyes wide in shock as the plastic restraints tightened around his wrists. Julian's voice rose, panic breaking through. "That's my son. He's a minor." Brent's expression shifted, his jaw tightening. "You want to join him?" And then, slowly, deliberately, Brent unhooked the walkie-talkie radio from his belt. He gripped it, not like a tool, but like a weapon. "This is your final warning," Brent growled. Julian didn't move, didn't flinch. His gaze locked on Brent's face. "My children are watching," he said, voice low, full of fury and heartbreak. "Don't become the reason they never trust this country again." Brent tilted his head, smile creeping back. "Too late for that." Sometimes the most dangerous warning is one wrapped in calm. Julian Cross kept his hand steady as the security officer's glare pierced through him. The fluorescent lights above Lane 7 flickered faintly, casting a sterile glow on the polished linoleum floor. Travelers moved on in the other lanes, dragging suitcases, sipping coffee, oblivious to the slow-brewing storm. But here, everything had gone still. The air felt heavier. The checkpoint buzzed with a quiet unease that only those in its direct path could truly feel. "I'll cooperate," Julian said, voice calm but firm. "But please explain why we're being detained." Brent Vorn took a half-step closer, enough that Julian could smell the faint sting of sweat and metal on his breath. His eyes didn't blink. "You people always ask too many questions," he muttered. The words cut sharper than Julian expected. He narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean by, you people?" Brent didn't answer. Instead, he reached behind the podium and retrieved a clipboard, slapping a form down on the counter with deliberate force. The sound echoed unnaturally in the space between them. "Sign the waiver," Brent barked. "Waive your rights, or we confiscate everything." Julian glanced down. The form was riddled with legal jargon, half of it redacted in fine print. His eyes flicked back up, his expression unreadable. "We're already pre-cleared. Global Fast Pass." "My sons!" Brent's hand slammed against the counter. "No devices here," he shouted, not at Julian, but at Caleb, who had pulled out his phone and tapped record. The phone was knocked from Caleb's hands and clattered to the floor, skidding a few feet before stopping at a stranger's shoes. Amir flinched and gripped his stuffed owl tighter. "Daddy, why are they yelling?" he asked, his small voice trembling. Julian crouched beside his sons, blocking them slightly with his body, even though he knew it offered no real protection. He placed a steadying hand on Caleb's shoulder, the other on Amir's. "We're okay," he said softly, brushing a finger across Amir's cheek. "Just a mistake." "Stay calm," Brent laughed, low and cruel. "Mistake?" His boots echoed as he stepped forward, looming taller now. "No, this is exactly what it looks like." Julian rose slowly, squaring his shoulders. He didn't speak yet. He didn't have to. The weight in his gaze said enough. This wasn't confusion. This was targeted. This was deliberate. Brent stepped in and chest-bumped him hard. The force was calculated, aggressive, but just below the threshold that could be called assault. Julian staggered back half a step but caught himself, not breaking eye contact. The line of passengers behind them had begun to stir. A few whispered. One man tried raising his phone, but a guard gestured sharply, warning him off. No one else moved. No one stepped in. Without warning, another officer moved in from the side and grabbed Caleb's wrist, yanking it behind his back and snapping a zip tie around it with a swift, practiced motion. Caleb gasped, stumbling. "Dad!" Julian's voice snapped out, filled with urgency. "That's my son!" Brent didn't flinch. He spun toward Julian, eyes wild now, and snarled, "You want to join him?" Julian froze. His instincts screamed. His body wanted to lunge forward to shield his son. But his mind, his strategic, always calculating mind, held him back. He raised his hands slowly, palms open. "My children are watching," he said, each word deliberate, carved from every fatherly instinct he'd ever had. "Don't become the reason they never trust this country again." The moment lingered. Brent's jaw clenched. A muscle twitched in his cheek. Then slowly, chillingly, he smiled. Too late for that. The air didn't move. Time didn't move. Only Brent did, fingers tightening around the heavy-duty radio at his belt, lifting it with a flick of his wrist as if it were nothing more than a reflex. Amir whimpered, sensing something was terribly wrong. Julian's breath caught, and then the countdown had begun, and no one heard the ticking but them. Expanded, Part 3. The radio struck Julian's head with a brutal, echoing crack. It was the kind of sound that silences a room, not because people are calm, but because their minds cannot comprehend what they've just witnessed. For one frozen instant, everything stopped. Brent's arm hung in the air, the radio still clutched in his hand, its edge smeared red. Julian's body had crumpled mid-step, legs folding awkwardly beneath him, his forehead slamming the polished linoleum with a second, dull thud. His briefcase slid from his hand and landed beside him, papers fluttering out like feathers from a broken wing. Amir screamed first, a sharp, heart-wrenching sound that pierced through the tension. "Daddy!" His small hands clawed the air as he tried to pull away from the officer gripping him, but the man held fast, ignoring the boy's frantic movements. On the other side, Caleb's body surged forward with raw instinct. "Dad!" he shouted, struggling against the zip ties biting into his wrists. He kicked out at the guard nearest him, catching him in the shin. The guard stumbled, but another tackled Caleb from the side, slamming him hard onto the cold floor. "Let me go!" Caleb shouted, his face pressed against the tile. His cheekbones scraped against the rough edge where two floor panels met, drawing blood. He tried to twist free, but the second guard pinned his arm behind his back, applying pressure until Caleb gasped in pain. Brent stood over Julian's motionless form, panting. Not from exertion, but something else. His chest rose and fell too fast, too uneven. The expression on his face was blank, almost serene, but his eyes told a different story. They were wide, unfocused. He had done it. The strike had landed exactly where he intended, but now he was seeing the aftermath. The blood was spreading. A dark crimson pool fanned out from beneath Julian's temple, soaking into the floor tile grout, touching the hem of his shirt. One leg twitched once, then fell still. A puddle began forming beneath his cheek, staining his skin. Brent's grip on the radio loosened, just slightly. His fingers trembled for half a second before he clenched the handle tighter. "Is he breathing?" someone shouted. An elderly man near the checkpoint dropped his carry-on bag and stepped forward. "He's not moving." Somebody called for help. But Brent turned sharply, pointing the radio like a baton of authority. "Stay back," he barked. The old man froze. Across the checkpoint, an airport janitor named Louis, gray shirt soaked with cleaning solution and sweat, stepped from behind his supply cart. "Sir, please," he said cautiously, both palms raised. "I have a radio, too. Let me just call." Brent snapped his head around. "We'll handle it." Louis hesitated, eyes flicking to Julian's body, then to the children still screaming. Amir was no longer crying. He was sobbing, his throat raw, his voice cracking. "Please, please don't hurt him. That's my dad." His legs kicked uselessly against the ground, his tiny sneakers squeaking on the floor as he struggled in the grip of a tall officer who refused to meet his eyes. The nearby passengers, once murmuring, now stood frozen in horror. Some held up phones, but others were too stunned to act. The entire terminal seemed to hold its breath, watching the scene unfold like a nightmare they couldn't wake from. Caleb, still pinned to the floor, turned his head. His vision blurred with tears and the sharp sting of pain, but he forced his eyes toward his father. Julian's body hadn't moved in minutes, but something inside Caleb refused to accept that. His jaw clenched as he swallowed the rising panic. Then he saw Brent, standing tall, watching everyone like he had just won something. The rage surged. Caleb's voice dropped to a whisper, low and dangerous. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." The officer pinning him down didn't notice, but Brent did. His eyes flicked to the boy. Just a glimpse, just for a second. But his grip on the radio faltered. The air around him thickened. The crowd didn't move, but the tension shifted. Even the guards looked uncertain now. Brent had gone too far, and for the first time, he knew it. And for the first time, Brent's hands trembled. The command echoed through the terminal with venom. "Shut down that feed!" Brent Vaughn's voice was sharp, panicked beneath his forced authority. He stood at the edge of the security control booth, veins bulging in his neck, pointing with the same hand that had just delivered a near-fatal blow to Julian Cross's skull. His other hand still gripped the blood-stained radio, trembling slightly as if even it recognized what had just been done. But it was already too late. Down a narrow maintenance corridor that overlooked the terminal floor through reinforced glass, Tyron Hall stood frozen. His hands clenched around his phone, which had been recording since the moment he heard the first shout. Tyron was an off-duty mechanic, clad in navy blue coveralls streaked with oil, a wrench still tucked into his side pouch. But in this moment, he was more than a technician. He was a witness. And, more importantly, he was Julian's former intern, 5 years ago during a summer apprenticeship that changed his life. He hadn't forgotten the kindness Julian showed him. He couldn't forget it, not when that very man now lay motionless on the floor. Tyron zoomed in slightly, heart pounding. From his vantage point, he could see everything. Julian's body was still, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, blood beginning to spread out from under his temple in a slow, alarming bloom. His hands twitched, barely perceptible, as if his body were trying to resist the unconsciousness pulling him deeper. Just feet away, his oldest son, Caleb, was screaming, his voice cracking with desperation as he kicked against the two guards pinning him down. His wrists were already raw from the zip ties, his face pressed painfully into the cold linoleum. Amir, smaller, was shaking violently in another officer's arms. His cries had faded into a hoarse whimper. "Wake up, wake up, wake up," he whispered over and over, lips trembling, fingers reaching out toward his father as if touch alone could bring him back. EMTs finally arrived. Their shoes squeaked on the polished floor as they jogged toward the scene. One of them knelt beside Julian, opening a trauma kit, but before he could begin assessment, Brent stepped in, blocking his path. "He lunged at me," Brent declared loudly. "It was self-defense." The kids were aggressive. The situation was under control until they snapped. The paramedic hesitated, uncertain, glancing at the blood on the floor and then at the two restrained boys. "He doesn't look like someone who lunged," the medic muttered. Brent narrowed his eyes. "Do your job," he snapped. "Not your opinion." From the control booth, a younger officer, barely out of academy, tried in vain to follow Brent's earlier command. He fumbled with the feed terminal. "Sir, I can't override the backup. There's a delay in cloud syncing." "I think," Brent barked, "just cut it from the source." But the security systems were designed precisely to prevent tampering. The backup cameras, motion-triggered and encrypted, had already done their job. One particular angle stationed high on a support column had caught everything. The moment Brent lifted the radio, the swing, the impact, and the expression on his face just afterward. Cold, satisfied. And the footage wasn't just storing locally, it was uploading. In a private server farm hundreds of miles away, a redundant copy of the feed was being transmitted, triggered by a high-impact alert built into the system, designed to document accidents or attacks. Back on the terminal floor, more airport staff began to arrive. Among them was Nolan Breyer, head of terminal operations. A no-nonsense man in his 50s with thinning gray hair, pressed slacks, and a clipboard under one arm, he came to a halt the moment he saw the scene. He blinked twice, once at the man bleeding onto the floor, once at the smug, upright figure of Brent, who now folded his arms as if he'd solved a problem instead of caused one. "What did you do?" Nolan asked, voice quiet but laced with tension. Brent didn't even hesitate. He stepped closer, meeting Nolan's eyes with a defiant tilt of the head. What needed to be done? Tyron, still behind the glass corridor above, zoomed in once more and captured that moment. That sentence. That smirk. He tapped his phone, double-checking that the recording had saved, then immediately uploaded the footage to his secure backup drive, one he'd set up years ago for engineering schematics and prototype data. It was slow, but reliable. More importantly, it was cloud-based, meaning once the file finished uploading, even Brent Vorn couldn't erase it. On the terminal floor, the atmosphere remained tense. One of the guards who had held Caleb now looked uneasy, as if he too had begun to process what just happened. The EMTs finally moved past Brent after Nolan barked, "Let them work." They carefully rolled Julian onto a backboard, placing a cervical collar around his neck. "He's semi-conscious," one medic said. "Pupil reaction sluggish, possible skull fracture. We need to move." They wheeled him toward the exit, Caleb calling out after him, "Dad, I'm coming. I'm coming with you." But he wasn't. Not yet. Officers still held him back, orders unclear, procedures confused. Tyron turned and sprinted down the stairwell toward the lower floor. His heart thundered. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a soldier. But he knew one thing. If he didn't act now, Brent would bury the truth, just like so many others had done before him. He typed a quick message into his phone, addressed to the one person he trusted with this kind of war. To Elijah Kane. Subject: Urgent, Julian cross-security incident, attached, video footage. 1. I saw everything. You need to act now. Upstairs, Nolan turned to one of the IT techs, a lanky man with glasses fogging up from nerves. Where's the rest of the footage? We're trying to retrieve backups, but the system's being overridden from the admin station. By who? The tech didn't need to answer. Both men turned slowly toward Brent, who was now speaking quietly into his earpiece. He didn't look at them. He didn't need to, because Brent thought he'd already won. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the second feed had already completed its upload. A hidden camera feed stored in a redundant system far from his reach. A camera he never accounted for. And on the other side of the country, inside the polished boardroom of Aeron Dynamics headquarters, a red alert notification pinged onto a secure terminal. An assistant read the alert and paled. "Sir, it's Julian. Something's happened." The board director stood. "Alert the legal team." Now, when justice bleeds, it often leaves footprints, straight to the guilty. Julian's body hit the operating table hard. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly as the surgical team scrambled around him, barking clipped phrases and measurements. "BP dropping. Get a pressure bag ready. Temporal fracture on the right. Possible orbital collapse. He's seizing diazepam now." Blood still clung to the collar of his shirt. His jaw hung slightly open, slack from trauma, and the right side of his skull had caved just enough to make even the most seasoned trauma nurse flinch. They'd rushed him in with no paperwork, no formal check-in, only a paramedic shouting, "Craniocerebral trauma, male, 40s, status critical." Down the corridor, Caleb sat alone in a hard plastic chair outside the ICU. His wrists still bore the deep red lines where the zip ties had dug into skin. A nurse had offered him water. He hadn't touched it. Beside him, on a smaller chair, Amir slept curled into himself, fingers tightly gripping his worn stuffed owl. Captain Fluff. His face was pale, streaked with dried tears, and occasionally his legs twitched like he was running from something in a dream. Caleb reached over, gently pulled Amir's hoodie down over his arms, and stared blankly at the closed double doors beyond which their father lay fighting for his life. Across the city, Tyron Hall sat in the back room of a modest apartment above a mechanic's shop, the buzz of neon from the streetlight outside painting stripes across his face. He watched the footage again, Brent's radio swinging downward, Julian's head jerking unnaturally from the blow, the panic in Amir's voice, the helpless fight in Caleb's limbs. Tyron's jaw clenched tighter with every replay. He knew what he had to do. He uploaded the file to a secure cloud server, encrypted it, then composed a terse email. Attached was the footage and a message that read, "Tell me this doesn't look like war." He sent it to only one man, Elijah Kane. Elijah was already awake when the message landed. A veteran in the courtroom trenches and a figure feared in executive circles, he had built his reputation dismantling systems that thought themselves untouchable. He wore no tie, just a fitted gray undershirt and sweatpants as he sat at the edge of his bed, reading Tyron's message. When he opened the video, something in him went still. He watched in silence, fists slowly curling on his knees. By the time the clip ended, his breathing was shallow, focused. He didn't replay it. He didn't need to. This wasn't a confrontation, he muttered aloud, voice low and firm. It was a sanctioned attack. His laptop screen lit with the first draft of a motion he'd started weeks ago, meant for another case. He deleted the file. A new window opened, blank. Elijah cracked his neck and began to type. Eyes hard, knuckles white. The name Brent Vorn appeared in bold at the top. He pulled Brent's personnel records from an old contact inside the aviation union. As he skimmed through the report, his stomach turned. 6 prior incidents. 6. Aggression under uniform. Every single one marked, but no disciplinary action. No suspensions. All buried by some unseen hand. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. A hospital line. Elijah Kane, came the voice, clipped, clinical. Yes. Mr. Cross is conscious briefly. He can't speak, but he's written a message. He asked us to share it with you. Elijah sat upright. Go ahead. The nurse read slowly. My sons saw everything. Protect them first. That's all it says. Elijah closed his eyes, lips pressed tight. The motion would wait, but not for long. Protect them first. At the hospital, Julian lay in a tangle of tubes and wires. His eye was bandaged. His jaw had been wired shut. A tracheal incision helped him breathe, the machine humming beside him. He was barely awake for more than minutes at a time, but his fingers had gripped the marker with painful resolve. He had written slowly, pausing every few seconds to breathe, until the whiteboard was filled with trembling letters. Protect them first. That night, just after midnight, a man in a surgical mask approached the ICU's rear entrance. He wore dark scrubs and a visitor badge that didn't scan. The nurse at the desk was on a break. Only the security officer, Raymond Vicks, noticed something strange. The man had no ID number on the badge. Hold up, Vicks said, standing. Name and relation? The man didn't blink. Family. Brother Julian didn't have a brother. Vicks narrowed his eyes. Which side? The man paused. Maternal. That was all Vicks needed. He stepped forward. You're going to need to wait here. I'm calling upstairs, but the man turned sharply and started back down the corridor. Vicks followed. Hey, I said wait. By the time 2 other guards arrived, the man had disappeared into the emergency stairwell. Cameras later showed him exiting the building 6 minutes later, face obscured by a hoodie. He was never identified. When Elijah got the report the next morning, he didn't speak for a long time. He simply stared at the security photo of the masked figure exiting through the service door. They're not just trying to cover this up, he said finally. They're trying to bury it. And everyone who saw it. He turned back to the motion he had started at dawn. Count 1, aggravated assault. Count 2, attempted murder. Count 3, child endangerment. Count 4, violation of civil rights under federal statute. And at the top of the file, in bold black letters, United States District Court versus Brent Vorn, Halton International Authority, and affiliated officers. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a warning shot. And suddenly, this wasn't just about brutality. It was about silencing a witness. The hospital lights buzzed faintly as machines blinked in rhythm beside Julian's broken body. Tubes ran from his arms and nose. His head was heavily bandaged, his skin pale beneath bruises that darkened by the hour. The ventilator hissed like a slow, dragging breath of the world outside trying to reach him. But Julian Cross, father, innovator, leader, lay silent, unconscious, as the storm he hadn't meant to start began to rise beyond the hospital walls. Outside, the public had no such silence. By dawn, a video clip, blurred at first, then suddenly sharp, flashed across 1,000 screens. Tyron Hall's hands had shaken as he uploaded the footage, but his voice had never been more certain. The title read simply, CEO beaten in front of sons, no arrest made. And with that, something snapped. News anchors interrupted programming. We warn our viewers, one said, what you're about to see is disturbing. Then came the moment. The blurred figure of Brent Vorn swinging a heavy radio, the sickening crack of impact, and Julian collapsing in a pool of his own blood while his sons screamed. By mid-morning, protesters had gathered outside Halton International, holding signs that read, Justice for Julian, and Our Children Saw This. The hashtags #broken in front of them and #no more silence flooded every platform. But inside the airport's high-security operations room, Brent Vorn showed no signs of concern. He stood with arms crossed, watching coverage with a flat expression. "Let them yell," Brent muttered, glancing toward the closed blinds. "They'll move on." "They always do." His voice was caught on a security office mic, one he didn't realize was still recording. A junior officer shifted awkwardly nearby. "Shouldn't we, make a statement?" Brent smirked and leaned back in his chair. "We already did. Suspicious behavior? That'll hold." But it wouldn't. What Brent didn't know, what none of the airport's inner circle realized, was that the footage he believed deleted from the internal servers had survived. A secondary camera mounted near the boarding corridor had recorded Brent leaning in, voice dripping with contempt as he hissed, "You're in first class now, huh? Let's see how hard your skull really is." The clip was short, 7 seconds, but it was time-stamped, and it was spreading. Back in the ICU, Caleb sat rigid in a plastic chair, one wrist still wrapped in gauze from the zip ties. His eyes were red but dry. Amir slept on a narrow cot in the corner, curled around the familiar shape of his stuffed owl, Captain Fluff. The sound of their father's machines hummed between them like an invisible clock ticking too slowly. Julian stirred, his hand twitching beneath the blanket. A nurse stepped closer, gently adjusting his IV, then paused. "He tried to sit up earlier," she said quietly, "but he collapsed. His body's not ready yet." Caleb nodded but didn't respond. His eyes stayed on his father. Outside the room, Elijah Kane paced the hallway like a panther in a cage. The moment he'd received Tyron's footage, he had moved into full legal gear. His laptop was open on the waiting room table, a dozen tabs flashing with case law and precedent. His phone buzzed nonstop, civil rights groups, federal contacts, journalists, all seeking comment, all pressing for action. "This wasn't a mistake," Elijah muttered under his breath as he drafted the federal filing. "This was sanctioned assault, and they think they can bury it under process." He looked up as a doctor emerged from Julian's room. "He's stable, but still critical. Skull fractures, orbital damage, some cognitive function returning, but he doesn't need to talk," Elijah said. "He already screamed loud enough when they hit him in front of his kids." The doctor nodded grimly and left. By evening, the legal motion was ready, meticulously worded, forceful but precise. Elijah named Brent Vorn, the airport's security board, and the city's Department of Transport as co-defendants in a multi-count civil rights violation suit. He included attached footage, eyewitness accounts, and an urgent plea for expedited review. But he added something else, a request not often granted, a special provision. Caleb Cross, age 16, was to be listed not only as a witness but as a co-complainant. A minor whose constitutional rights were violated in real time. A child who had watched his father's skull be shattered and whose testimony, Elijah believed, would carry the raw, undeniable weight of truth. The motion was signed and time-stamped. At that exact moment, somewhere inside the airport's media room, a junior PR staffer hit send on a scheduled press release. "A high-risk passenger was restrained after suspicious behavior," the statement read. Airport personnel followed appropriate protocol. But the statement was drowned almost immediately by a different flood. The new video. The damning 7-second clip. Brent's face, his voice, his threat, his smirk. It played across millions of screens before midnight. News anchors watched it in stunned silence. Community leaders demanded his arrest. Politicians weighed in. Even major airlines operating within Halton International issued separate statements condemning the incident and calling for independent investigation. And yet, Brent was still on duty. In a dark office 2 floors above Terminal B, he sat alone, sipping coffee, ignoring the vibrations of his phone. He told himself the world would calm down, that the outrage would burn out. He didn't see the way the tide had shifted. He didn't see the newest petition, already gaining hundreds of thousands of signatures, or the class action suit quietly forming behind Elijah's motion. But in the hospital, Julian stirred again. This time, his eyes opened briefly. Caleb leaned in, gripping his father's hand. "You don't have to talk, Dad," he whispered. "Just rest. We're going to get him. I promise." A flicker passed across Julian's face. Not pain, not fear, but pride. His fingers curled slowly over Caleb's. Elijah stepped into the room, the motion printed and ready. He didn't speak right away. He simply nodded, then knelt beside Caleb, his voice low and certain. "We're not just going after Brent," he said. "We're going after every name that ever signed off on men like him." As the machines beeped softly and the night thickened outside the window, Elijah placed the motion beside Julian's bed. It was heavy, not in weight, but in truth, because Brent Vorn didn't just strike a man that day. He lit a match in a room soaked in silence, and from that fire, a reckoning had begun. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in court is a child's broken voice. Brent Vorn sat motionless on the edge of a worn leather armchair, the dim light of the television flickering across his face. The air in the small rented condo just across from Halton International's Terminal B was thick with silence, broken only by the hum of news anchors reciting facts he already knew. His jaw was tight. The muscles around his mouth barely moved as he chewed on the corner of his thumbnail, a nervous habit he thought he'd buried years ago. The screen flashed headlines. Airport under fire after brutal assault. CEO beaten in front of children. Where is Brent Vorn? He leaned forward, muttering to himself, "They think a little noise will change the game." His voice was quiet but sharp. He reached for the remote and turned up the volume, only to hear another commentator discuss the leaked video again, footage of the moment he raised the radio and brought it down on Julian Cross's head. What they didn't have, he told himself, was the context, the control, the real reason. At least, not yet. What Brent didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that another video existed, one he thought never would. Down in the lower levels of Terminal B, Tyron Hall stood in a locked maintenance office, the air musty and thick with engine grease and burnt coffee. He was holding something small and square in his gloved hands, a body cam unit, dusty but functional, the LED light blinking faintly. He had found it inside a dented locker in the Far East corridor, left behind by a rookie guard who hadn't shown up for his last 2 shifts. When Tyron connected it to the terminal's backup power hub, the screen came to life. The footage hit him like a punch. The moment was crystal clear. Brent's arm swinging high, the radio arcing downward, the sickening sound of impact, and then a blood-smeared Julian slumping to the floor. But the most devastating part wasn't the violence. It was the look on Amir's face, just behind his father. The boy screamed, "He's not breathing," and tried to run forward but was pulled back by another guard. And then Brent smirked, right into the lens, cold, proud. Tyron staggered backward, bile rising in his throat. He knew what this meant, what it could change. He inserted a secure SD card, backed up the file, and locked the original body cam back in the locker. No one could know it came from him. Not yet. Not until it was in the right hands. By midnight, Elijah Kane had the footage. He watched it in his office, blinds drawn, a single lamp lighting the room. His expression was unreadable until the final frame played. Then his hand slammed down on the desk. He stood up, paced. "This is it," he whispered. "This is the blow-by-blow." The next morning, the world shifted. Caleb Cross sat under bright studio lights, a camera pointed at him, a reporter across from him reading notes. He wore a pressed navy blue shirt and clutched a folded sheet of paper in his hands. His lips were dry. He had already gone over what to say with Elijah, but now, facing the nation, all he could think about was the weight of the moment, the memory. The reporter leaned forward. "Caleb, can you tell us what you saw?" Silence stretched. Then Caleb inhaled, deep, slow. "I saw my dad's head bend in ways it should never bend." He didn't cry. He didn't even blink. The room was silent. The producers behind the glass had frozen. The reporter didn't know what to say. Caleb simply lowered the sheet of paper, stood up, and left the frame. By noon, the clip had been shared over 40 million times. Phones buzzed across the country. Texts were exchanged between fathers and sons. News anchors wept on live television. Social media lit up, not with outrage alone, but with reflection. How do we protect our children from seeing this? How do we explain what power did to that family? And somewhere, inside the cold walls of the rented condo, Brent Vorn finally saw the footage he didn't know existed. The body cam. The smirk. The scream. His own eyes locked with the lens, as if mocking the very people who now demanded his arrest. His expression changed for the first time in days. He stared at the screen, then down at his hands, and for just a moment, they trembled. Back at Halton International, airport executives were unraveling. Emergency meetings were called, sponsorships pulled out, press conferences were canceled mid-sentence, Airlines operating out of Terminal B scrambled to protect their brands, issuing public apologies and demanding an independent investigation. Terminal traffic dropped. Travelers began choosing other airports, but still, Brent had not been arrested. Protected by Marshal Drix, the chief of operations who'd built his entire career on quieting problems before they became headlines. Drix sent messages to Brent urging silence. "Let it blow over," he'd said. "The outrage cycle moves fast." But this wasn't outrage anymore. It was transformation. Every hour the video stayed live, public momentum surged. Elijah knew what to do. He quietly contacted a federal prosecutor with jurisdiction, shared the new footage. The reaction was immediate. Plans for criminal charges moved forward, fast. That evening, Elijah stood by the hospital bed where Julian Cross lay, his face still bruised, his speech limited. He showed him the video. Julian's eye, only one of them could open, glimmered, then filled with tears. His fingers moved across the hospital bedsheet to find Caleb's hand. Caleb, sitting nearby, squeezed gently. The pain remained, the fear, the memory. But now, so did the proof. And across the country, children, fathers, and sons watched in silence. And a nation finally felt what it meant to bleed and be powerless in public. He thought humiliating a black CEO in front of his kids would go unanswered, but justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. Julian's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the nurse's call button. Tubes fed into his arms. His head was wrapped in thick gauze, and the left side of his face remained an angry shade of bruised purple. His jaw was still wired shut, but his eyes burned with purpose. The nurse entered quietly, startled to see him trying to sit up. "I need phone," he rasped through clenched teeth, barely audible. "Elijah?" the nurse asked softly. He nodded. His fingers tapped against the bed rail with urgency. Moments later, Elijah Kane stood at his side, still dressed in a charcoal gray suit from the night before. His tie loosened, his face drawn with exhaustion and fury. The hum of machines surrounded them, but Julian's intent sliced through the noise. "Don't just get justice," Julian whispered, the strain in his voice cutting through the stale hospital air like glass. "Change the system. That made him." Elijah didn't blink. He gave a firm nod and placed a hand on Julian's shoulder. "Then that's exactly what I'll do." That night, Elijah sat alone in a law office lit only by the blue glow of his monitor. The silence was broken only by the clack of keys and the sound of archived files printing, pages of buried complaints, whistleblower memos, and unprocessed grievances that painted a dark portrait of the culture at Halton International Airport. 19 complaints. 19 times Brent Vorn had been accused of using his uniform as a weapon. 19 times he'd walked away untouched, protected by bureaucracy and one man, Marshal Drix. Elijah read through them one by one. One passenger shoved against a wall over a boarding pass, another left with fractured ribs from non-compliance. A teenage boy detained without cause because his shoes matched a description. All hidden, all sealed. Drix had signed off on each dismissal with the same cold rubber stamp. By sunrise, Elijah filed a supplemental motion, not only against Brent Vorn, but against the entire airport security apparatus that had enabled him. The motion was delivered in person to the federal courthouse and sent electronically to every major media outlet in the country. It included a formal demand for Marshal Drix's immediate removal, citing gross negligence, systemic abuse of authority, and obstruction of accountability. Attached was a timeline of Brent's incidents, internal emails, and redacted whistleblower testimonies. The motion struck like lightning. At 11 a.m., under mounting pressure, Drix held a press conference at Halton International's press hall. Cameras lined the back wall. Flashes popped. He stood at the podium in his dark navy uniform, shoulders tense, eyes scanning the crowd. "The recent incident is under full review," he began, voice steady. "Our officers acted under circumstances that are still being investigated." But before he could continue, something unexpected happened. From the crowd outside, a group of protesters, young men, fathers, workers in airport vests, set up loudspeakers near the terminal's main doors. One of them, a former baggage handler named Marcellus Green, held up his phone and pressed play. Drix's voice echoed from the speakers, an old audio file. "Passengers who think their money makes them safe need a little reminder now and then. the recording said, cold and unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the crowd inside. Journalists whispered. Microphones turned. Drix froze mid-sentence. His face blanched. A security officer to his right leaned in, whispering urgently into his ear. Drix stepped back from the podium, muttering something inaudible before being escorted quickly through a side door. The press conference ended in chaos. Back at the hospital, Elijah turned off the news broadcast and checked his phone. A new tip had arrived, a location ping. Brent Vorn hadn't left the city after all. According to a confidential source, he was hiding at a rental condo less than 5 miles from the terminal. Elijah dialed U.S. Marshal Grant Hollow. He's trying to slip away. You have to move now. By nightfall, 4 unmarked vehicles pulled up outside a quiet residential complex. Brent, wearing a gray hoodie and carrying a duffel bag, stepped into the parking lot with a rental car key in his hand. But before he could reach the door, voices shouted from behind. "Federal marshals!" Hands up. Brent spun, startled. His hand twitched toward his jacket pocket. But he didn't make it far. He was tackled against the hood of a parked SUV, arms restrained behind his back with a single, practiced motion. Flashlights illuminated his face. Cameras caught every second. As his face was pressed to the metal, a reporter who had followed the marshals called out from behind the barricade. "Mr. Vorn, any last words?" Brent, face red and twisted in frustration, muttered, "It wasn't supposed to go that far." He was led away in cuffs, silent now. The moment was surreal. What had begun as an abuse of power behind the walls of Lane 7 had now spilled into the open, a symbol of what unchecked authority could become. Back in the hospital, Julian sat in silence as Elijah returned with the news. The two men exchanged a long look, one filled with exhaustion, grief, and hard-won resolve. Julian's bandaged head tilted slightly, his eyes closing slowly, not in pain, but in something deeper. Relief. Elijah whispered, "He's in custody." Outside, the media began calling him something new. Not just a victim, but a force. A face for reform. Julian Cross, the CEO who rose from a pool of his own blood to shake an empire built on silence. Because when silence breaks bone, truth breaks chains. Part 9. Expanded. Brent Vorn's mugshot hit national television just before dawn, stone-faced, jaw tense, and eyes half-lidded with defiance. His arrest, the footage, the screams of 2 children, none of it softened public fury. Within hours, Halton International Airport's terminals were surrounded by protesters holding signs that read, "Not just a passenger," and "Justice for Julian." But while the country wrestled with rage and confusion, Julian Cross lay in the quiet, fluorescent-lit silence of Halton General Hospital's Neuro-Recovery Wing, trying to move his left foot. Every movement was a war. Tendons that once responded with precision now felt like ropes being pulled through tar. His skull was still wrapped in gauze. His jaw wired shut. His right eye remained heavily bandaged. But what haunted Julian more than the pain was the silence. He hadn't spoken to his sons, not really. No bedtime stories, no words of comfort, just gestures, and the broken humming beep of machines that told him he was still alive. With trembling hands, Julian scribbled on a notepad over and over the same words. "My children watched." It wasn't just a memory. It was a wound, fresh, echoing, unavoidable. Elijah Kane entered the room quietly that morning. The normally unshakable attorney paused in the doorway, taking in the sight of his friend. Julian's fingers stopped moving when he heard the door. Elijah didn't speak right away. He crossed the room, placed a folder on the bedside tray, and then rested one hand on Julian's shoulder. "They're here," Elijah said softly. Julian's bandaged head shifted slightly. His eyes blinked. "I brought them in for a few supervised minutes," Elijah continued, "but I had to prep them first. They're going to testify. It's not just about the trial, Julian. It's about the truth." The door opened again, this time revealing Caleb and Amir. Caleb walked in first, steady and focused, but older somehow, as if the week had carved years into his spine. Behind him, Amir clutched the stuffed owl, Captain Fluff, so tightly its seams stretched. His eyes darted to the machines, to the wires, and then finally to his father's face. Julian lifted his arm with great effort. Caleb rushed forward, grabbing his hand. Amir followed, climbing gently onto the edge of the bed. For a moment, no one said a word. Just breathing. Just the sound of togetherness. Julian mouthed slowly, "We're still together." Caleb nodded hard, tears threatening. "Yeah, Dad." "We are." Elijah gave them space, stepping out into the hallway. He had other battles to fight, because while Julian recovered in that hospital room, Brent's defense team had launched their counterattack. In a sleek office downtown, Brent's attorneys filed a bold motion. They called Julian's behavior non-compliant. They labeled Tyron Hall's video inadmissible and unverified. One of the lawyers, Marcus Reeve, went so far as to call Julian's injuries partially self-inflicted due to resistance. They planned to bury the truth under paperwork and misdirection. But they had underestimated the second witness. That afternoon, a man named Kellen Drexler walked into Elijah's law office. He was nervous. His tie was crooked. His hands trembled as he held a folder to his chest. Kellen had been a TSA supervisor for 6 years. Quiet, observant, loyal to the system until now. I think I need to come clean," he said, lowering himself into a chair. Elijah watched him carefully. "What do you mean, Mr. Drexler?" Kellen's throat bobbed. "Weeks before the incident, Brent and I were in the break room. He was upset, said something I didn't report. I thought it was a joke, angry venting. I didn't think—" "What did he say?" Elijah asked, eyes sharpening. Kellen closed his eyes. He said, "If one of those fancy suits ever gets mouthy, I'll put him down like a mutt." Elijah leaned forward. "And you're willing to testify to that?" Kellen nodded slowly. "I didn't report it then. I don't know what I thought, but I watched that video. I saw that boy screaming. I can't unsee it." Elijah exhaled, his mind already drafting strategy. "We'll need a sworn statement, immediately. And then you'll testify under oath." Kellen's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'll do whatever it takes." That evening, Brent sat in his cell, still smirking for the cameras. His legal team assured him that the backlash would pass. "It always does," they'd said. "Public memory is short." But they hadn't counted on Kellen Drexler. By nightfall, Elijah submitted an addendum to the case, Kellen's statement included, along with a motion to strike Brent's defense claims for lack of merit. News of Kellen's confession leaked through whistleblower channels, and social media ignited again. This time, the headlines read, "Insider confirms. Brent Vorn's violence was premeditated." In the hospital, Julian watched the news with Caleb at his side. He couldn't smile, his jaw still refused, but something in his eyes brightened, just a little. Justice was no longer a wish. It was a path being paved by truth. Elijah returned late, eyes tired but satisfied. He sat at Julian's bedside, placed a fresh document on the table, and said, "He's cracking." Julian raised a questioning brow. "Kellen," Elijah explained. He came forward. "Said Brent had threatened something like this weeks ago. We've got his statement. It's over for them. This isn't just a trial anymore. It's a reckoning." Julian reached for his pen and notepad again. He wrote just 3 words. "My sons watched." Elijah nodded. Yes, and so did the world, and in that moment, the system that protected Brent started to bleed from the inside. The heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse swung open with a creak that echoed through the marble hall, and all eyes shifted instantly to the figure being wheeled inside. Julian Cross, his head still bandaged and jaw wired shut, moved slowly across the aisle, every movement deliberate, his face pale under the harsh white lights of the courtroom. Cameras clicked and flashed from the press gallery, but the noise seemed to fade against the silence of the room itself. Behind him walked Caleb and Amir, their small frames stiff with determination, their eyes fixed forward as though they carried the weight of their father's dignity on their shoulders. The silence was charged, almost reverent, as Judge Norman Hale adjusted his spectacles and tapped the gavel once, signaling that the trial had begun. Julian's appearance alone was a statement stronger than any opening argument. He did not need words. The scars on his temple, the swollen eye, the tremor in his hands spoke loudly enough. Elijah Kane, his attorney, stood beside him with a steady presence, his shoulders squared, his eyes sharp with a readiness that hinted he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. The prosecution wasted no time. The first piece of evidence flickered onto the courtroom screen. Brent Vorn, the radio raised high, the brutal strikes landing on Julian's skull, and Amir's scream that followed. The sound alone made the jury gasp, some averting their eyes, others staring in disbelief. The rawness of the footage tore through the calm, shattering any illusion of routine proceedings. Brent's defense team, well-dressed and calculating, moved quickly to spin their narrative. Their strategy was bold, too bold. They painted Julian as an entitled man who resisted lawful orders, who escalated the situation himself. The attorney's voice carried a practiced smoothness, but the words hung hollow in the thick atmosphere of the courtroom. Brent himself sat at the defense table, shoulders set, jaw tight, a mask of control hiding the storm beneath. His eyes flicked nervously to the jury, then back to the table, as if searching for a lifeline. The defense's illusion lasted only until Caleb was called to the stand. The boy walked with slow, deliberate steps, his hands clasped in front of him, his face pale but resolved. The oath was administered, and then he lifted his chin, his voice steady though his throat trembled. "My father told me to stay calm," Caleb said, his eyes locking on the jury with the clarity of truth. "He tried to protect us." He never raised a hand. The room was silent, every word echoing like a hammer against stone. He swallowed, hesitating only for a moment before continuing. "The man who did this looked at us before he hit him, like he wanted us to see it." His words lingered, heavier than any lawyer's argument. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, his polished shoes squeaking faintly on the wooden floor as he tried to pivot. But the illusion had cracked. When Tyron Hall was called, the fracture became a collapse. Tyron walked to the stand with the quiet strength of someone who knew the importance of the moment. His voice was calm, unwavering. "I once interned for Mr. Cross," he said, folding his hands together. "He treated janitors with the same respect as generals. That man wouldn't throw a punch, he'd write a policy." His words cut with precision, striking at the heart of the defense's argument. Brent shifted in his chair, his face twisting with frustration, his fists clenching beneath the table. One by one, the prosecution rolled out their evidence, body cam footage showing the strike from another angle, internal text that revealed Brent's simmering disdain for passengers he saw as above their place, radio chatter laced with arrogance, each piece stacked upon the other, forming a wall too high to climb. And then came the final blow. A hidden camera recording filled the screen, capturing Marshal Drix, Brent's longtime protector, instructing staff to scrub the report clean. Gasps filled the courtroom, whispers spilling across the gallery like a tide breaking against rocks. Judge Hale leaned forward, his brow furrowed, his voice sharp. "Mr. Drix will answer to these charges," he declared, and within moments Drix was indicted for obstruction of justice. The ripple that passed through the room was more than shock. It was betrayal exposed, a fortress of lies crumbling in real time. Brent's face drained of color as he realized his shield had fallen. For years he had leaned on Drix's shadow, confident in protection, confident in silence. Now that shadow had turned, and the light was burning him alive. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. His chest rose and fell too quickly, his hands twitched, and the mask of smug control he had worn for so long fractured under the weight of truth. Julian sat quietly at his table, the tremor in his hands returning as he leaned slightly on his cane. His gaze never left Brent, his silence more condemning than 1,000 accusations. Elijah stood tall beside him, his expression carved with calm victory, though his eyes carried the storm of battle. The jury, leaning forward in their seats, no longer needed persuasion. They had seen enough. Brent swallowed hard, a shallow sound lost beneath the shuffle of papers and the shifting of jurors. His shoulders sagged, his mask gone. For the first time since the trial began, his bravado slipped into fear. He stared down at the table, the weight of his own choices pressing heavily against him. And as the courtroom absorbed the collapse of his defense, one truth became undeniable. Without Drix, without the shield he had always relied upon, Brent Vorn stood alone, exposed to the judgment of the law. When Brent heard that his protector had flipped to save himself, he broke. His shield had shattered, and all that was left was guilt. Brent Vorn sat still in his seat as the courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. On the 6th day of the trial, just as the defense prepared to rest, Brent leaned toward his attorney and muttered something under his breath. His lawyer stiffened immediately, whispering back with urgency. Brent shook his head. "I need to," he said aloud, his voice strained but audible. Gasps echoed around the room. Judge Norman Hale narrowed his eyes. "Mr. Vorn, your counsel advises against this. Do you understand the consequences of testifying on your own behalf?" Brent nodded slowly. "I do, Your Honor." Julian sat behind the prosecution table, unmoving. His sons were by his side, Caleb focused and protective, Amir quietly gripping the edges of the chair. Elijah Kane, the lead prosecutor, looked toward Brent with narrowed eyes. The move was unexpected, risky, desperate. The bailiff swore Brent in, and he stepped slowly to the witness stand. For the first time in the entire trial, his confidence had drained. He looked smaller somehow, paler. The weight of the courtroom bore down on him like judgment itself. "I thought he was reaching," Brent began. His voice trembled, not with regret, but with the raw edge of fear. "Everything happened so fast." I panicked. Elijah rose from his seat with slow precision, his steps deliberate as he approached the witness box. The air thickened, as if the room itself held its breath. "You panicked," Elijah echoed. "Why?" Brent blinked. I thought he might have something. "Like what?" Elijah asked, voice cool. "His wallet? His ID? A phone?" "I don't know," Brent stammered. "He moved toward me and—" "You were surrounded by 3 other guards. His children were crying." He had his hands raised. Elijah stepped closer. "So, I'll ask again. What exactly made you panic?" Brent's eyes darted toward the back of the room, toward no one in particular. He looked at me." "He looked at you?" Elijah repeated, his voice suddenly quiet. Brent nodded once. "And what did that look say to you?" Elijah asked, stepping directly in front of the jury box now, hands clasped behind his back. "Was it threatening? Angry?" Brent hesitated. "No, it was calm. But," he swallowed hard, "he looked at me like he was better than me." Elijah stopped. The words hung in the air like a blade suspended between heartbeats. The judge didn't move. The jury sat frozen. Even the click of courtroom pens had stopped. Elijah slowly turned back to Brent, one eyebrow raised. "Better than you," he said softly. Brent's mouth twitched. It felt like that. Elijah walked to the center of the room. His eyes never left the jury. "You all heard that," he said, voice stronger now. "Not fear. Not a weapon, not protocol. Resentment. That's what made Mr. Vaughan act." He paused. "Not a threat. Not danger. Just a man, a father, a husband, a leader, looking at someone who couldn't stand to be reminded of what he wasn't." Brent shifted in his seat, visibly sweating now. His hands clutched the edges of the stand like a lifeline. His lawyer looked away, jaw clenched. Elijah let the silence stretch for several seconds before walking back to his table. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Julian stirred in his seat. Painfully, he leaned on his cane and pushed himself upward. It was not a dramatic movement, not a speech or an outburst, but a deliberate stand. His sons rose with him, steadying him on each side. His face, still lined with scars and bruises, turned toward Brent. And Brent looked up, only to see a man he could not break standing tall in front of him. Julian said nothing. He didn't need to. The courtroom cameras flashed. Reporters' pens moved furiously. That image, the bloodied father rising, not to retaliate but simply to be seen, was more powerful than any testimony. Outside, crowds watched through the glass walls and live feeds. Across the city, people stood in living rooms, in subway cars, in classrooms, witnessing the moment as if it belonged to them too. Inside, Brent looked down, his shoulders slumping. His mouth opened to speak again, but no words came. For the first time, he seemed small. Not feared, not respected, just a man caught in the truth of his own choices. His lawyer scooted slightly away from him, not out of strategy, but out of quiet shame. The jury watched silently. Their eyes no longer flickered with uncertainty. Julian sat down, slowly, deliberately. Caleb helped him. Amir leaned in, resting his head on his father's side. No one said a word, because in that moment, words weren't needed. The truth had already been spoken, not in testimony, but in the quiet resolve of a father who refused to be erased. And that silence, the one Brent had once used to control others, had turned against him. The courtroom was silent, not the tense silence of uncertainty, but the heavy, waiting silence of judgment. The jury had returned after only 4 hours, an astonishingly brief deliberation for a case of such magnitude. As they filed in, avoiding Brent Vaughan's eyes, the atmosphere inside the chamber shifted. Even the hum of fluorescent lights seemed to fade beneath the weight of what was about to be spoken. Julian sat stiffly in his wheelchair, his body weakened but his presence still commanding. Caleb stood to his left, steady and upright, while Amir clutched the edge of the wooden bench with tiny, trembling fingers. All three faced forward, locked in a shared stillness. The foreman rose, a young man in a gray suit whose hands visibly trembled as he held the verdict slip. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Brent Vorn, guilty on all charges." He read the list one by one: attempted murder, aggravated assault, child endangerment, obstruction of justice, abuse of authority under federal statute. As the final words echoed through the room, Amir's lips quivered. He didn't cry out, he didn't speak, but tears streamed silently down his cheeks, tracing the path of every fear, every nightmare he had buried since the day in Terminal B. Caleb, his face pale and unreadable, reached over and squeezed his brother's hand, steady and sure. He didn't look at Brent. He didn't need to. The man who had shattered their family stood a few feet away in an orange jumpsuit, shoulders slumped, eyes glassy. For the first time, Brent Vorn looked small. Julian, unable to speak due to the permanent damage to his vocal cords, reached out with a trembling hand and placed it over both of his son's fingers. The motion was slight, but powerful. More powerful than any closing statement, any press headline, any chant from protesters. It was a father reminding his children that, despite everything, they were still a family. Judge Norman Hale, his voice steady and commanding, leaned forward. "Given the evidence, the testimonies, and the emotional trauma inflicted, particularly upon minors, I am including an exceptional clause in this sentencing. Brent Vorn will serve his term without the possibility of early release." Gasps rippled through the gallery, but no one dared speak. The gavel came down once, sharp, final. The courtroom did not erupt. It inhaled. It held its breath. The moment didn't need noise. It needed memory. Outside, the world was already reacting. Within hours, headlines lit up screens across the country. But at Halton International Airport, something even more extraordinary was happening. The entire security board had submitted their resignations. Marshal Drix, once the untouchable chief of operations, was now named in 5 criminal indictments for evidence tampering, suppression of internal reports, and obstruction of justice. His carefully built fortress of silence had finally collapsed. But this was only the beginning. Inside a conference room overlooking Capitol Summit, Elijah Kane stood at a podium with Julian's board members seated behind him. He held up a thick binder labeled Cross Protocol. "With Mr. Julian Cross's full support and testimony, we are introducing new legislation, effective immediately, to hold every airport security agency accountable." The proposed bill was sweeping: independent civilian oversight panels, mandatory body cams for all on-duty personnel, whistleblower protections, and unconscious bias training embedded in every federal security certification. It wasn't a patch. It was a complete rebuild of the system. Julian, still healing, watched it all unfold from a secure hospital suite. His company issued a powerful statement the next morning. The opening line read, "Innovation means nothing if those who build the future are crushed by the past." Investors had feared a mass pullout. Instead, the opposite happened. Stocks in aerodynamics stabilized within a day, buoyed by unprecedented public support. Major defense partners recommitted. The board, in a unanimous decision, named Caleb Cross as honorary youth liaison for the company's new social policy outreach division. It wasn't symbolic, it was strategic and deeply personal. 3 weeks later, in a closed internal ceremony, Julian stood with the help of a walker. Cameras were forbidden. Only a few key witnesses, board members, and family stood in attendance. His breathing was labored. His right hand trembled. But when he reached the podium, something shifted in the room. Everyone went still. Julian looked out at the crowd, then down at his sons, who watched him with quiet awe. He gripped the microphone gently, like it might break. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, with effort, he leaned forward and let his voice emerge. It was gravelly, faint, strained, but every syllable was clear. "My children taught me how to stand again." And in that moment, a broken voice moved a nation. 6 months later, the concourse at Halton International buzzed with the usual hum of travelers, rolling luggage, and muffled announcements over distant speakers. But inside Terminal B, near Gate 17, time had slowed to a respectful hush. A crowd had gathered, airport staff, local news crews, airline executives, and dozens of passengers who had paused their journeys to witness something quietly historic. The bronze sculpture stood tall and resolute at the center of a roped-off area, a father, slightly bent at the shoulders but not broken, holding the hands of two sons. One boy looked upward with quiet pride, the other leaned slightly forward, caught mid-step, as if preparing to lead. The trio faced forward, gazes cast into an invisible horizon. Below the figures, etched deep into the base of the sculpture, were the words, "When strength is taken from one man, it can rise in those who watch." Julian Cross stood a few feet away, leaning slightly on a dark steel cane. The cane had been a gift from Caleb, handcrafted and engraved with the family initials, JK plus CK plus AK. His right eye remained clouded, its vision dulled forever by the blunt force trauma that had once splintered his skull. His voice, though recovered enough to speak again, still broke at unpredictable moments. But none of that mattered today. Today, he was upright, present, unshaken. Beside him, Caleb adjusted his black blazer, taller now and more grounded. Amir stood quietly, one hand tucked into his older brother's, his other hand clutching the old stuffed owl named Captain Fluff, its seams repaired, its eyes scratched, but still intact. A small band around Amir's wrist read, "Honor Walk," the name of the trauma center being opened just inside the terminal, funded in part by Julian, and named after his late brother Malik, a childhood friend lost to violence decades before. The ceremony had just concluded. A single violin played a soft tune as those in attendance lowered their heads for a moment of silence. The moment passed, and then the terminal resumed its rhythm. But Julian didn't move. He watched as travelers passed by the statue, some stopping, some walking on, but most slowing down just long enough to read the inscription. "You think they'll forget?" Caleb asked, his voice low but firm. Julian looked at him, his face solemn. "No, not if we keep showing up nearby." Tyron Hall stood in uniform, now promoted to airport technical coordinator. He saluted Julian from afar, the two locking eyes in mutual understanding. Tyron had done more than film a tragedy. He had preserved dignity when the world tried to erase it. A civilian medal hung discreetly beneath his ID badge. Elijah Kane arrived just then, stepping beside them in a charcoal suit, less sharp than usual, more reflective. His firm, now expanded and rebranded as the Cross Foundation for Justice, was mentoring a new generation of civil rights lawyers. But Elijah wasn't there as an attorney today. He was there as a friend. "You still hate stairs?" he asked Julian with a smirk. Julian chuckled softly. "Only when I'm falling down them." They all laughed quietly, but the laughter faded into thoughtfulness as Elijah nodded toward the trauma center behind them, its doors glassy and new, marked with a silver placard, Malik Cross Center, for child witnesses of public violence. Julian exhaled, slow and deep. "I wanted it to feel like a place where something good starts." "Not where something ended," Caleb smiled slightly. "It does." Later that afternoon, Julian found himself on the courthouse steps, the same steps where the trial had ended, where cameras had once swarmed and microphones once reached like claws. Today, it was quiet. No press, no public, just family. Amir had fallen asleep against his side, his breathing soft and even. Caleb sat on the other end of the bench, sketching in a notebook, lines forming the early concept of a new drone he was designing for school, one he'd tentatively named the Sentinel. Julian stared ahead, lost in thought, watching the clouds roll across a pale sky. The wind shifted gently, brushing through his hair and rattling the edge of Amir's backpack. For a long time, no one said anything. Then, slowly, a young reporter approached. He looked nervous, respectful. "Mr. Cross," he asked gently, "forgive me, just one question?" Julian nodded once. The reporter hesitated, then asked, "Was justice served?" Julian didn't answer right away. He placed his hand gently over the jagged scar at his temple, letting his fingers rest there for a moment. He looked up at the sky, its color soft and infinite. Then finally, his voice low but steady, he said, "They tried to break a man in front of his sons. Instead, they built a legacy neither of them will ever forget. Moments later, the tables turned. The same radio he used to attack became the weapon of his downfall. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It confronts themes of racism, excessive force, and the trauma inflicted on Black families through abuse of power. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic injustice, provoke reflection on accountability, and inspire empathy and urgent action against racial violence.